Purpose Highway is a space for discussions that drive connections toward people's highest purpose to build a better self and a better world. Join me for Season 1, where I start to uncover stories of entrepreneurs and thinkers that are making an impact. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and enjoy today's episode. I have as a guest today the one and only Oleg Lougheed. Oleg, it is great to have you. You know, every time I see you or even think about you, two words come into my mind.
Oh boy.
Courageous conversation. Why is that? Courageous conversation. Why do you think I'm thinking that?
That's awesome. It's a great point that you bring that up. I think for me, this concept of courageous conversations, it kind of, when I stepped on to that journey, what I realized was stepping into my purpose and actually being in a position where I can share that story as a way of service to others took a lot of courage. And there were a lot of quote unquote courageous conversations that I had to have along the way that I think have helped me shape who I am today and understand what I had to do at this particular time and phase of my life. So when I think of that theme, along with the theme of overcoming odds, those are two themes that really describe who I am in a nutshell.
You know, one of the things that is amazing about you is that, as you said, you literally do live and embody both courageousness in conversation and overcoming odds. But for a listener who may not know a lot about you, talk to us a little bit about your background so we understand really, you know, when you're talking about overcoming odds in your case, we're not talking about someone whose idea of being resilient against adversity was stepping over an inconvenient anthill in the backyard. We're talking about someone who had to work with and overcome circumstances that were far more dramatic and challenging, honestly, than a lot of us can ever imagine. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think for me, as I think about my own journey, it's been really fascinating to actually step into this space and kind of look at this concept of what is your story, right? In 2020, one of the things that I've realized is that there's so much pressure when it comes to that question. And that is, what's your story? What are you all about? And what I realized was that within that story, oftentimes what I heard was people chose to focus on some of the more painful points in their lives, and in particular, those within childhood. What I realized over time was that even though that's a significant portion of my own individual story, it's not the only thing that makes me who I am today. So there's the story that I'm living in right now. There's a story that I'm building towards. And so I think this concept of past, present, and future, it always exists within this space that I share. And the other thing that I'll mention prior to going into kind of the details of where I was born and different circumstances that I faced was I was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday, and him and I were talking about this concept of time and how it's very difficult, at least my experience has been, it's very difficult for me to live in a culture where you're literally bounded by time. Now, everything is on a deadline. And I even get curious as I do certain activities, and let's say I have an hour or 2 hours to complete it. Like, is it even possible for you to be in the moment and experience that story and that journey that you're creating? Or is everything made with the intention of onto the next thing and then the thing beyond that? And so I get curious about those concepts. And it's a really fascinating thing for me to explore, even in regard to that story aspect. Like, when I get asked the question of what is their story, yes, there was a tendency for me to share the story of being born in Russia and being born to a set of circumstances where my father was in prison, my mother was an alcoholic, and my sister ended up becoming my legal guardian due to those circumstances. And so when I think about that past and all the challenges that I had to go through, as far as really accepting that household for what it was and understanding that I may not get the same love that a friend of mine who's a neighbor gets from their parents. I may not get an opportunity to sleep all under one roof with that household. And so what I chose to do in the upcoming years is I chose to focus on other elements of that story, because that's not all who I am. Yes, I was born to a very challenging set of circumstances, but at the same time, let's face it, who was it? It's all a matter of perspective to a degree.
Well, that is an interesting point. And when you were talking a second ago about the concept of past, present, and future, it got me even thinking about the word now or present. Because the minute we utter the word now or present, or the minute we even think about it, that period has already passed. And we're already in what was at the moment we were thinking about the present, the future.
Yeah.
And so to what extent is there even a present? When you're talking about story, when people talk about stories, it's my understanding they tend to truly focus exactly on what you're saying. The traditional elements of a story. There's an origin, there is an arc of conflict, there's a period where that conflict hits its highest peak of difficulty or challenge, and then there is a resolution. In life, there may be sets of incidents that follow that pattern, but life itself isn't necessarily that way. Our life doesn't necessarily follow a Shakespearean arc of any sort. And so when you're talking about trying to be present and be mindful about the whole picture, that really resonates, because it can be very difficult for us to focus on creating or molding ourselves into a particular narrative. And the idea that you were mentioning a second ago about deadlines being part of what drives us to artificially, in my opinion, create these story arcs is something that can perhaps cause chaos or confusion. Or do you think I'm just rambling in this crazy metaphysical way that has no meaning about anything, let alone anything that you want to talk about today? Answer me.
I think it's very difficult to live in the now in the culture that we share. The story that a friend of mine shared was this concept, or a couple of the stories that he has had an opportunity to experience, and that is work with different groups in Africa. And there's some parts in Africa where there is no concept of time. And in fact, there's a quote that I wrote that I think would be very relevant to a conversation like this, or at least this particular segment. And this is what a friend of mine had shared through a conversation that he had with an individual when he was conducting a workshop in Africa. And that is, Europeans have the watches and we have the time. And it got me thinking as far as what is time to begin with? And why do we, in this culture, measure time as a second-by-second instance rather than just embracing time for what it is?
What is time to you?
I think to me, it's difficult to kind of look at it through that lens as far as, you show up whatever time may be, because I've been so conditioned to think that you have to get to this point at this particular time. This is a start, this is a middle, this is an end. It's difficult for me to conceptualize what does it mean if you don't have those three constructs put in place. I think for me, time, the way that I'm looking at it right now, it's simply it's a space. That's the best way I can describe it. It's just a space through which I can experience whatever it is that I have. I try not to think in those incremental parts because it makes it go by that much faster. And if there's anything else that I've learned, it is this. As I aged, this concept of time, once I started to look at it from the hour by hour basis, it sped up exponentially. Every year it goes by faster. And there were years when I was able to actually compare one year to the other, and I did practically the same exact activities, but yet the year that was beyond the previous one seemed to go by significantly faster. And so it got me thinking, like, why does that even happen?
Yeah, it reminds me, I have a memory of when I was a little boy in a local department store and I wanted some candy. And my mother said, "You can't have it. We'll have it in a couple of hours when we get home." And to me, that couple of hours, I remember I wanted to cry because that couple of hours seemed incomprehensibly far in the future. Of course, now a couple of hours, I'm glad to have a couple of hours. This hour that we have will pass so quickly, I don't even know where it will go. So that's a very fair question. But I do want to ask, though, when you're talking about a concept like overcoming odds, there's a temporal quality to that I would be curious to know how you reconcile. Because, if I may, one of the things that's so powerful about your story, if it's viewed through an archetypical storytelling temporal lens, is that it gives people hope. And hope, to me, implies a difference between at least the circumstances that you might be in now and the possibilities of tomorrow.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile all of that?
So when I think about my journey and a lot of those previous circumstances, not only from my childhood, but even from last week or yesterday, or even the hour before this conversation, the thing that really stood out to me and something that I tried to implement within my mind. So when you speak of a mindset, this was a mindset, I guess you could say, hack or tool that I've been able to tap into. And how I was able to find this out is a couple months ago, I was watching a video in which Oprah Winfrey was sharing her story. And one of the things that she mentioned was when she was younger, the reason why she was able to kind of get through some of the abuse she had gone through when she was a kid was that she continued to believe in this concept that there was going to be a better day, that there is that light at the end of the tunnel. And I remember in hearing those words in particular, what stood out to me was the same exact thing, and yet I was the one that chose to look at life through that lens when I was younger. So what I believe that when I was a little kid, the way that I chose to look at the world was I viewed the world not for what it was, but for what I aspired it to be. So I've always had this, I guess you could say, optimistic and futuristic view of the world, regardless of what the circumstances may be. So with that said, when I think about this concept of overcoming odds, first of all, I don't think there's an end point to it to begin with. I think if there's anything, it is opportunities to develop different tools, different ways to look at a circumstance from a completely different lens. And I think this concept that some of us get stuck in my opinion, in trying to eliminate some of these things. You know, we experience depression. The first thing is, how do we eliminate it? Rather than how do we embrace it as something that's always going to be there, part of our journey. I mean, let's face it, anxiety, depression, whatever other negative thoughts and feelings that you may have, they're always going to be there. The difference that becomes is that as you elevate within your mindset, those things also transform. So it no longer becomes the depression that you experienced 5 years ago, but rather it becomes a different form of it. So it comes to you in a different layer. So everything, as a friend of mine once mentioned in a conversation, she said, certain things are like an onion. I believe everything's like an onion. As soon as you peel back one layer, know that there's going to be another layer to go through. And it's literally a never-ending onion. You know, you're going to have layer after layer after layer. And so when I thought about my own journey and the different obstacles that I had to overcome within my life, I understood that overcoming odds, it's a journey. It's not a destination to get to. It's really about a process. It's documenting a process through which I've been able to overcome and continue to overcome whatever the challenges may be in front of me, regardless of how difficult they may be perceived.
That is very forward thinking. I think one of the things that's beautiful about it also is that it acknowledges that for all of us, until the day we pass, and perhaps even beyond, depending on what your belief system is, that growth, change are inevitably going to be part of the human experience. And overcoming odds is something that, as you mentioned, you don't just do once or twice in your past and suddenly all of your odds are overcome and you're fine. I mean, part of what's embedded in what you said about aging, for instance, and time going more and more quickly, that itself, our experience of time moving by more and more rapidly as we have less and less of it on this earth, is an odd. And it's an odd that only escalates with time. Do you feel, though, that there are some circumstances that people might have, or some people who simply might say to themselves, my days of having to overcome odds are over, or I've hit my final challenge that I choose to fight, or I want to be in a mental space where I don't have to overcome odds. I can simply dwell in them, or I can simply accept my existence for what it is, not have to fight, not have to change my mindset, not have to grow anymore. And if you do, what would you say to those folks as someone who's committed to the concept of overcoming odds?
So first things first, I don't think that day ever comes, in my opinion. I don't think the day ever comes when you no longer have any challenges to work through. Second thing is, in my opinion, it's all a matter of mindset. It's all a matter of how you choose to approach whatever the circumstance may be. And one brief disclaimer I'll mention is this: whatever I'm sharing during this particular conversation did not happen overnight. This took many
really?
years.
I was going to say, you really are a genius then if it did. But, it's good to disclaim those sorts of things, but that would be scary if it did.
Yeah. In
a good way, I guess, an overpowering way.
This took many years of practice and understanding, and many times of kind of falling on my butt and having to start over again with the same process, the same thought. But what I chose to do is I chose to look at adversity through the following lens. What am I here to learn? And what is this here to teach me? What that has given me an opportunity is understand that life is happening for me and not to me. That is, I actually have a choice in how I approach life and how I choose to engage within it. So when I think about what you just mentioned as far as those situations where, let's say in the case of someone who may feel hopeless and feel like they can't take any more of the challenges that come along their way, what I would encourage those individuals to do is maybe consider asking themselves a similar question. Like, what is it there to teach you? Because here's the thing that I've learned about life. In my opinion, every single event, every single circumstance has an opportunity for you to walk away with a takeaway or a lesson learned. It all boils down to, how do you choose to look at that situation, and what's the lens that you choose to embody?
So do you even believe there's such thing as adversity?
I do. I think adversity does exist, but I don't think that adversity has to be perceived through the lens that many of us perceive it through. And that is something that is there to impede you, something that is there to stop you from whatever it is that you wanting to accomplish or aspire to do. I think adversity is there to teach you. I think adversity is there to help you recognize things about yourself and your own journey that you may not have had an opportunity to do so just yet.
Do you think that learning from adversity is enough?
No, I think, and this is a concept that it took me a while to understand. For the longest time, I was exposed to this theory that knowledge is power. And I believed it. I believed it for however long. What I realized over time is that knowledge is not power. Knowledge with action is power. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to this thing that you just mentioned, as far as is only learning from adversity enough, I think learning from adversity is the first step. But choosing to implement those insights and make them work however they're going to work within your life, that's the next step that I choose to take within it. When I read books, I no longer read a book cover to cover. I try and read it in increments, chapter by chapter, or 2 or 3 chapters at a time. Yeah. And then I go and implement it somehow within my life. I share that knowledge with those that I have conversations with, or if it's more of an actionable step, different ways to face my self-limiting beliefs or courage or develop self-confidence, I try and do some of those exercises to tap into some of those other elements of myself and my being. So the way that I would summarize that is knowledge with action is power, and adversity gives you the first step. And that is, it gives you an opportunity to know something that you haven't had an opportunity to know before. But beyond that, for me, it required the step of choosing to step into it and choosing to use that knowledge in some other form or shape that can help me actually fuel the service and purpose that I've been able to tap into.
Why do you think you developed that action orientation? You know, we both have met so many people in our lives. Well, I at least have. Maybe you've never met anyone like this, but I'd be shocked if you've never met anyone in your entire existence like this, right? Who may have taken, who may have experienced adversity and chosen to learn from it, but not for whatever reason been able to actually do anything about that. And as a matter of fact, when I look back at my own life, when I first began to think about self-development and improvement and the concept of mentoring myself, reading about particular situations, getting the knowledge in hand was one thing, but absorbing it, really taking it into the heart, and then bam, throwing it out into the world as a changed interface between me and the world was something that took a while for me to do. I consider myself probably unusually driven. Maybe a lot of folks never get to that step at all. What do you think makes you be able to take that step? And if I'm someone that doesn't feel like I can or know I can move into action or how to move into action, what would you say to someone like me?
So for me personally, what happened was, in complete honesty, I got tired. I got tired in solely knowing things or learning things just for the sake of learning them, to be honest. And it felt that it was a never-ending loop, never-ending cycle of one question after another and another and another. And there was no actual implementation or greater sense of understanding that I was gaining through that process. And so I think there becomes a point, in my opinion, where enough is enough. And that is, you know enough to get started. And I believe that's actually true at every step of the way. Regardless of where you may be, I'll speak from my perspective. Regardless of where I may be along this journey, I wholeheartedly know that I have enough information at any step of the way to get the process started. Does it always turn out perfect? No, because I don't believe perfection exists. I think everything, I'm an imperfect human being living in an imperfect world. That's how I look at it. And I think far too often, in my opinion, we stop ourselves from action because we want to have all the bells and whistles. We want to be perceived in the best possible way, in the best possible light. We want to, or we strive for some of the other individuals or companies or movements that may be a step or two or three ahead of us. And that's the version that we envision as the starting point for us. When in reality, the starting point for you and that whole journey to begin with is going to be completely different to who you are. And so what I've learned over time was that there were so many situations where I actually talked myself out of action. I mean, let's face it, stepping into action is hard. It's difficult to actually step into action. And more importantly, I think it's also difficult to step into action on a consistent basis every single day. It's a habit. It's a habit, just like anything else. Choosing to ask for help, choosing to brush your teeth in the morning, stepping into action, it's the same exact thing. It's a conscious choice you have to make. Yeah.
And sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel tired of stepping into action. I say to myself in the back of my mind, but I don't want to have to do this. I'm fighting something. I'm learning something new every day. I'm stepping out and putting myself at risk every doggone day. Why can't I just get that red carpet rolled out for me? It don't happen.
Yeah. It doesn't happen, and I don't think it will happen.
Yeah.
I think it's something that you take on your own will, your own power, and then you manifest it in whatever you envision it. The thing that also clicked for me in regard to action was, I remember there was a period of my time where I asked myself the question of why me?
Mm-hmm.
Why was I the one that was meant to go through X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
Why was I the one that was meant to step into this space
I
to help
absolutely,
others?
yes. Yeah, and I bet a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah. What I realized was, in reframing that question and understanding that if not you, then who else? That's all it took to get started. The other thing is this, and this is something that I've learned along my journey, is that even with missions and visions that are well-intentioned, you are bound to receive negative feedback. That's a given. Every single day when I email different organizations and groups to approach them as a speaker at their events, I can't tell you the number of people that tell me F off, or don't ever email me again, or stop in all capital letters. So things like that. Yeah. And it's
not to be understated, but stop in all capital letters. Not to just be calm about it.
Yeah, but that's another circumstance that may prevent someone from continuing to take that action. Mm-hmm. Is the overwhelming amount of negative feedback and criticism. And so that's where I think, again, this concept of reframing plays a big role. And for me, I choose to understand it as far as this is just what's going to be part of my journey. This is a requirement. When you think about a checkbox or a list of things that you're going to have to go through in order to achieve X, Y, and Z in your life, that's just another line on that checklist. And that's choosing ways to deal with negative criticism. So in some situations, I look at that as feedback. If the person actually gives a reasoning for explaining, but in situations where they write stop in capital letters, I just delete. I just move on to the next one. And I think far too often, and I've learned this through experience with some of the people that I've worked with as part of this organization, it is that people, or some of the people that I worked with, let's say they'll receive 10 no's and that's it. They'll stop. So there becomes a threshold for the number of rejections you can receive as an individual in order for you to stop. For me, I don't know what that number would be, but it would have to be a pretty substantial. To be honest with you, at this point, I don't even think there is a number. I've received so much of it along the way that it doesn't bother me anymore.
Yeah. And you do read these stories about founders. For instance, I read one, and I don't remember the exact nature of the company, but it was a woman, I believe, who was from Nigeria, who was pitching a new idea to investors and funders and banks, everyone everywhere across the globe. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. I mean, it was, and for years, she believed in this idea. She was committed to it. She knocked on every door in Africa, North America, South America, Europe, even Asia that she could imagine. Right. And finally, that one person said to her, yes. And it was, I mean, it really, when it went through, I think it was 7 years maybe that she was asking this over and over consistently. I mean, she didn't give up, but now she's killing it. She's raking in the money. Her idea, her business are flourishing. And so it goes as to really setting a high threshold for when that no is going to be the last one. And, I'm hearing with you a similar sort of spiritedness.
And there are different ways to look at those circumstances, right? So some of the perspectives that I've been able to embody based on the conversations that I've had, one is no, is not yet. Yep. That's one way to look at it. Another perspective that I've heard is every no gets you that much closer to a yes.
Yeah.
And so it really just boils down to looking at those I call them kind of hacks or tricks or tools or whatever, whichever way you want to frame this, and looking at them through that lens instead of choosing to accept the no for what it could be. Because here's another thing, let's face it. If I were to send an email to you and you send me something along the lines of, please don't ever email me again, or stop, or not interested, it has nothing to do with what you actually sent the email about.
Yeah.
It has everything to do with whether or not that opportunity exists on that end, or that person might be going through something that day. Yeah. They might have experienced a loss. And so they're not in the space where they can respond to you in what's called positive way, when in reality, that's the space they're in, and that's how you just approach them. So you just happen to be a channel through which they literally pass their energy through. And it has nothing to do with your message. It has nothing to do with your vision. And that's something that I want to encourage people that even listen to this show and whatever else, is that depersonalize those concepts. Mm-hmm. It's not about you. Mm-hmm. The problem, this concept of the problem is you, I choose to look at it the other way. The problem is not you. Mm-hmm. In fact, there is no problem to begin with. Yeah. It's just the person is going through a circumstance that you might have gone through, but you didn't have to respond to an email when you were going through it.
Yeah. Yeah. And boy, once you adopt that, it can be hard. It's not necessarily first nature for a lot of folks, but it can save you so much grief and stress, because you're not wasting that mental energy on why. You're not pointing a finger in rage at them. You are not pointing a finger in guilt or shame at yourself. And that frees up mental space to be able to do amazing things, like the amazing stuff that you do, and that I want you to tell folks about. You're a busy man. What are you so busy doing? What are you taking all this action on?
Well, for me, one of the first things that I'm doing every single day, and there's actually, it's right behind me, it's called The Power of Your Story. And that is what I'm doing. I'm living out my story. I believe that my story is a book and I'm the author of it. Every single experience, every single circumstance I go through is a chapter within that book. And so for me, at this point in my life, what I chose to do was 3 years ago, I chose to step into this action that we're talking about, and to build a space for other people, in a nutshell, to be heard and to be appreciated through their stories. Why I wanted to do that was because I felt that for the longest time of my life, there were so many parts of that story that I felt I wasn't able to tap into, because I didn't have opportunities to share it with people in a way where I can truly be understood for who I was. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to create this community of individuals who have gone through different forms of hardships, where we can come together and be able to mutually understand each other's journeys. The concept that clicked for me in wanting to create this is this. There was a phrase that I come across, I don't know however many years ago, but it said, if it doesn't exist, create it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I chose to do. I stopped waiting. I stopped waiting for someone else to step into that space and create something that I desperately needed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Instead, I just chose to act.
So what is that space? And tell us a little bit about, I know you have a podcast, you have a symposium coming up. I want to hear about all this stuff. A live stream show with some person I've never heard of before, but I want to hear about
that. Well, I will save the full laundry list of everything that I'm doing and just give you a summarized version of it. But the space is called Overcoming Odds, and it's an organization that has multiple different pillars. One of them is it's a space for people to share their stories. Another one is a podcast that we host, and it comes out 3 times a week, where we have similar conversations to this. And the whole intention is to just share this whole human experience without kind of the mindset or the theme of here are the 5 tips to success, or, the 3 things to courage. Yeah. It's not really the intention. It's more so just to have a regular conversation through which we can go deep and explore some of these topics. The other thing that we have is events. We have an event coming up actually next month in October called Survive to Thrive, A Parent's Journey.
Yeah.
And I know that's something that you and I actually had a chance to collaborate on the first one.
Yeah.
And the best way that I could describe that space is it's really just a space for people to come in, to share, to learn, to listen. And then from there, be able to walk away with an opportunity to shift your own perspectives.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing, man.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a podcast that I host with another guy. His name is Scott Mason.
Yeah. I don't know him. And what briefly, just tell folks about that.
That one is called Just a Squirrel Looking for a Nut, Trying to Get Out of This Rut. And it's really a space that you and I chose to create in order to shine a different light and a different perspective to adversity and some of these challenging circumstances. So it's packed with laughter. It's not meant to be a comedy show, but I think at certain aspects of it, it turns out to be a live comedy show.
Yep, absolutely. And where can folks reach you?
Well, I would like to be off the grid, so I would like to say that there is no way. But in the time being, the best way that people can reach me is probably through LinkedIn. And then when it comes to any of the work that we've done, it's just across social media platforms. Excellent. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever you can think of. And if people have any questions or if there's anything that comes to their mind that they'd like to share, I encourage all of them to reach out. And then from there, just ask the question, share the story. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to understand.
I love it. I love it. And you are very true to that spirit. Oleg, it has been a true pleasure having you on today. Everyone listening, thank you for taking the time. Check out more about Oleg, where he said for you to go on his social media. It's outstanding. This is Scott Mason checking out. See you next episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Join our community today at purposehighway.com and subscribe to get notified when new episodes go live. Scott Mason, checking out.